The theme today is a subject very dear to our heart, which is the role of hydrogen in delivering net zero. I'm sure you've all been looking at your social media feeds, news feeds. It's an issue that is very much at the heart of the discussions taking place in Glasgow at COP26. And the last 2 years have been a little bit of a whirlwind for us as hydrogen has got onto the agenda and is now one of the key focuses within government policy. And we're going to talk about some of those issues around the hydrogen development options this morning. We've got a 3-hour programme, quite a lot of material to present to you. And as well as trying to communicate some of the reasons why hydrogen is such an important element of the debate, we're going to try and also bring some focus onto what we are doing regionally here in the New Anglia area, supported by the New Anglia LEP and the Greater South East Energy Hub, to try and get us recognised within the debates that are taking place as obviously a very significant energy producer, but also to give you a flavour of how we see some of the options and opportunities playing out within this region and how we can move forwards and try and deliver the overriding objective of becoming one of the, if not the clean growth region of the UK, certainly one of the leading regions, and one that is adopting strategies and approaches which work for this region in particular. So we're going to talk about a mix of general issues, but also how we are trying to bring that agenda to life here in the New Anglia region and within the east of England more generally. You will be meeting all the Hydrogen East team this morning. We have a full agenda, and we're going to try to take this away from being a narrow, almost technical or regulatory debate into one that bridges the gap into the local economy and explain to you where we see some of the real drivers and differences around development of hydrogen in this part of the world. The first part of the programme that the team will run through with you is very much a scene setter about the basics of hydrogen, why it has become a key element of the debate, and how the policymakers are beginning to develop strategies and programmes around it. We're then going to take a more detailed look at some of the technical opportunities around hydrogen production. It's a very wide spectrum of opportunities, and we're going to look in some detail, not too much I hope, around some of the choices, the issues and the interactions. To break things up, we then have the first of 2 interactive polls that we're going to share with you to get some of your views. And of course, there is the question function within the chat box, which we will also hopefully be using regularly through the programme. And then we're going to take a very short break, 5-10 minutes, to get a cup of tea or whatever. Then my team are going to take a more focused look around some of the key sectors where we see real issues and opportunities in developing a hydrogen economy in the New Anglia region. And we've broken that down into 4 parts. Each part will be delivered by a different member of the team, and we will run through transport, then heat, followed by agriculture, and then issues around flexibility, which is a very important consideration when assessing the opportunities for hydrogen. We then have another poll, followed by a brief break, and then we're going to try and wrap things up and give you a more immediate feel for how we're actually tackling the opportunities. Hydrogenesis is a research company. We are not an advocate of a particular solution, but through the work we've done, we like to think we've built up a very different narrative around hydrogen development opportunities, particularly in the New Anglia area, but also more generally within the east of England. And then we're going to look at how that position might layer up over time in a way that creates a very different type of regional market with hydrogen at the centre of it. And then we'll pull things together, try and pull out some key points, and set out some next steps of the work that we will be undertaking, and which we hope you will continue to follow going forward. So COP26, very, very important. We're a long way from the central debates, but we want to give you a sense of how we are approaching the opportunity from a regional perspective. So this next slide is really just an introduction. I've introduced the main players. We're very grateful to the New Anglia LEP for supporting this event and arranging it today, and also to the sponsorship of the Greater South East Energy Hubs. The Greater South East Energy Hub. The emphasis, as I said, is going to be on looking at some of the emerging technical options within an overall framework of achieving really quite drastic emissions reductions. In that context, we are a little more than 2 years on from adoption of the net zero target, very important. That has really kicked hydrogen up the agenda, and we are now seeing a lot of interest amongst all the major industrial and developing states around their own individual strategies for making sure hydrogen is a key part of the portfolio. And a lot of the events up in Glasgow are focusing on that. What I should first say, however, is the role of hydrogen is not a hypothetical role. It's really about how big a role it should be, how it should be manifest at a regional level, and in what sort of projects, and therefore what the regional contribution should be. So we think we're beyond a speculative what-if debate. We are now moving into a more specific consideration of exactly how hydrogen can be deployed and in what circumstances here in the east of England. And that is not just about production. It is about all the other elements in the process of creating the basic fuel that can then be converted into hydrogen, and then how it can be stored, but very importantly, where the use cases are. Unless you've got a two-sided market, that is a hypothetical debate. You can produce as much of a commodity as you want, but unless you have security of demand, it will either underachieve its potential or be misdirected within the wider economy. So that's very much a subject that we are going to emphasize today, where we think hydrogen will be used, how it can support the wider regional economy, and what the opportunities will arise for regional stakeholders. So that's what today's about. On to the next slide, please. So who are Hydrogen East? Well, we're basically a research body. We were formed just over 18 months ago as we went into lockdown to try and raise awareness of hydrogen opportunities in the east of England, with a view to promoting the technology and supporting the development of local supply chains by demonstrating the research and the needs case for developing hydrogen. Because we are focused within the regional economy, we are communicating with a wide range of stakeholders, from the LEP to local authorities to offshore developers, to people who are looking to participate in the supply chain, but also with businesses and organizations who are going to create the demand for hydrogen. We believe we have the potential to support this region becoming a leading hydrogen region. There's a lot of competition, both in terms of thinking and for support from government in developing hydrogen strategies. We think we have a very different regional economy. We are not an industrial cluster. In fact, there's very little industrial consumption of energy in the east of England, but we do have a number of what we believe are very appropriate use cases that can pull through earlier development of hydrogen, which over time will then lead us to pull through new sources of production, particularly from the growing offshore wind sector. But that's by no means the only focus. We believe, however, that we have the ability to establish a different type of regional cluster here, which has elements of use across the power sector, heating, transport in particular. We'll say a lot about transport, agriculture. There are many sectors where we believe use cases can develop early on and which can differentiate this region. We actually launched in July last year, and since then we've already added, created 5 roles, full-time roles, and we're looking to add another couple before Christmas. We've already delivered 2 major projects. The first was an early stage study on the Bacton Energy Hub, excuse me. That was a report we delivered in May this year. It can be found on our Hydrogen East website, details at the end. And we are just on the point of delivering a very different type of report around what we call the Lowestoft power park project, which we're going to talk about later. And yesterday we had some very good news with the announcement of the awards under the Community Renewal Fund, and we will be doing a clean hydrogen project looking at opportunities around the Hethel Engineering Centre on the west of Norwich. So we've hit the ground running and we're running hard now to catch up. On this slide, we show you some of the people who we originally talked with in setting up the organisation, Sizewell C, owned by EDF, my own organisation, New Anglia Energy, and my co-founder, Jonathan Reynolds' organisation, Oppergy. And since then, we formed some very good working relationships, trying to understand the regional context and the opportunities, particularly with consultancy Arup, the offshore renewable energy catapult. We also have done quite a bit of work with Scottish Power, and other regional players have also supported our research programme, including the New Anglia LEP and North Norfolk District Council. So I think in little more than a year.
Yeah, it doesn't look much fun, doesn't it?
So we can move on to the next slide, please. Before I kick over to the team to talk about the wider policy setting, I thought we'd try and root the conversation firmly in the New Anglia region. This is the first of two slides that we're going to show. The first on Norfolk, the second on Suffolk. No prioritisation intended. What we show here is on one half of the slide, the basic current energy infrastructure. And when we say energy here, it goes beyond the conventional electricity system. We look at gas pipelines, electricity distribution and transmission lines, as well as the growing array of energy production processes. As we will mention through the course of this morning, we place a lot of emphasis on geospatial mapping so that we can take the policy options, the top level policy goals, and try and rationalize it within the specific circumstances that we find on the ground. And we have put a lot of work into this. We'll be launching an energy mapping platform for wider stakeholder use later this year. And I know Michael, one of my team, will be saying a little bit more about some examples of our mapping as we go through today. On the other side of the graph slide, what we have shown by local authority are the emissions profiles that currently exist within the region. These are territorial emissions, so everybody's emissions broken down by the 6 sectors that the government reports to. And immediately you begin to see that there are some very real differentiating factors that we need to factor into our analysis. So an obvious point, one I've already made, is that industrial emissions are very low by average standards across England. But domestic emissions are very high. And one of the reasons for that is because of the patchwork reach of the gas distribution system in this part of the world. We'll come back to Bacton later, a very important energy infrastructure asset, but large parts of Norfolk and Suffolk, to a lesser extent outside of the urban areas, semi-urban areas, do not have gas supply. That has real impacts and challenges because of high levels of fossil fuel emissions, and it also limits or skews the choices for net zero actions. Another strong differentiating factor in Norfolk, at least, are the very high level of transport emissions, and we'll pick that up later because it's actually very important for how we see early stage opportunities for developing hydrogen as a solution in transport. And we also have high positive emissions, which is not a good thing because of the high levels of peat landscape that we have here, which means that there is a significant contribution to the overall territorial emissions in this part of the world. If we move on to Suffolk, it's kind of similar. The issues around access to gas are less constricting. Equally, transport emissions are even higher, particularly in 2 or 3 of the regions that have transport links that run through to the East Coast ports, such as Felixstowe. So that gives different opportunities and challenges, and we're trying to bring this style of thinking into our wider thinking on where hydrogen facilities can be developed in the region. So that's just setting the scene. I can see that some questions are coming in. We'll come back to those shortly. But now we're going to, before we go and look at the policy setting, we're going to show you a video. So Charlotte, video, please.
The challenge of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is a complex one and requires us to deploy a range of technology options across sectors as diverse as transport, heating, electricity generation and industrial processes in order to replace fossil fuels with sustainable alternatives. Significant momentum is now building around hydrogen as one of these keystone solutions, alongside increased electrification, improved energy efficiency and behavioural change. Hydrogen is a highly versatile element that can be made and used in a variety of ways. Production can involve the reformation of natural gas alongside carbon capture processes, the gasification of biomass, or via electrolysis, whereby water is split into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen can also be stored, transported to the point of use, or undergo additional processing to create other useful compounds, such as ammonia. When needed, hydrogen can then be burned to generate heat for homes, businesses and industry, or passed through a fuel cell to generate an electrical current. This latter option is the technology used in the hydrogen vehicles being developed and tested in cities throughout the world, including here in the UK. Hydrogen East is working with stakeholders across Norfolk and Suffolk to assess potential locations for hydrogen production and to identify early sources of demand. we believe that a unique regional hydrogen cluster could develop that helps New Anglia to achieve its ambition to become the UK's clean growth region. Norfolk and Suffolk may not have significant industrial loads compared to the hydrogen clusters being developed elsewhere in the UK, but they are home to some nationally important energy assets that could host collaborations with new hydrogen developments to the benefit of both. Such sites include the Bacton gas terminal in North Norfolk and the 2 gas interconnectors to Europe, depleted gas fields that could store carbon, a vast and growing offshore wind fleet, existing and planned nuclear power stations at Sizewell, as well as multiple small-scale renewables developments. The region also has significant maritime, road haulage, agricultural and food processing sectors, as well as a rural rail network that would suit hydrogen conversion. All of these applications could adopt low-carbon, hydrogen-derived products in the future. Looked at together, these conditions could provide a fertile base for a different type of hydrogen cluster, linking up small, diverse projects, including electrolyzers that could be progressively scaled up, and underpinning it with aggregated demand from a variety of emerging regional use cases. While the government and network companies work to complete safety testing and commercial support mechanisms, Hydrogen East will continue to evaluate and support the potential for hydrogen to transform the regional energy landscape. We look forward to sharing our thinking with you as we explore this exciting opportunity to support the delivery of net zero.
Super. Well, that was a first for me, and we were very fortunate to get Alan Partridge to do the voiceover. So that was a double first. No, it's actually Jonathan pulling your leg. We're going to now look at some of the policy context before we dive into some of the more technical and some of the choices that we face. And I think Michael's going to take us through the next section. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. Yes, if we can go on to the next slide, please. Yes, I think we've already heard from Nigel just now, and also the video that just flashed up on the screen. The reason that we're so focused on hydrogen and the role that hydrogen could potentially play in meeting net zero. And I suppose the drive over the past few years has been the fact that we now have a net zero target that we have to meet as a country by 2050. We've seen the Climate Change Committee outlining a role for hydrogen in that future in terms of reaching net zero emissions, but also through 2030 and 2040 in reducing emissions. And now, most recently, we had the government outline in their hydrogen strategy the role that hydrogen will play going forwards. A lot of stuff within that strategy was setting out what we're going to be doing in the coming years to make sure it's ready within the 2020s and 2030s to be deployed. But overall, we've got a lot more direction in respect of where this market's likely to go. And so there's kind of 3 key points there on the slide that you can see in terms of why hydrogen is expected to be such a useful tool in delivering net zero. So you've got that first point around it being versatile. So the fact that you could have your large offshore wind fleet generating electricity in summer that would otherwise go to waste, you could use that energy to store it, to use it in the winter when energy demands go high and when heating demands go up as well. And you've got that almost seasonal storage opportunity with hydrogen that you're going to need in a future where we're getting more and more renewables coming online. You've also got the fact that it is a clean source of energy. It's a green gas first and foremost, which will help to deliver some of those system benefits that we spoke about earlier on. And also the fact that you can use hydrogen in a variety of ways. So we touched on some of the use cases just then, but you can look at using it in fuel for vehicles. You can look at it for heavy machinery, use in the existing gas system for heat, or even turning it back into power to send onto the electricity grid as well. So if we just pop on to the next slide, I thought it would be useful to just give a short run through on the key types of hydrogen. So you will have heard the colors being bandied about around blue, green, gray, hydrogen. On here, these are the main ones that we think it's important to be aware of. So that first one there at the top, gray hydrogen. So this is the common way of producing hydrogen in the UK today and also around the world. I think around 27, 30 terawatt hours of hydrogen is produced through the gray hydrogen method today, and only around 3% is green. So in producing gray hydrogen, what you do is you typically use steam methane reformation of fossil fuels, and that produces hydrogen, but it also produces carbon. And right now, through gray hydrogen production, that carbon is not captured and it's released into the atmosphere, and so it's no good as we're moving towards net zero. Blue hydrogen is basically the same process, but that carbon that's emitted is instead captured and stored. And the capture rates here are uncertain because we haven't had a large scale carbon capture and storage project undertaken across the UK or globally. And so, you could get something in the region of 90 to 97%. It could possibly be lower, it could possibly be higher. We will start to see the outcomes of the effectiveness of carbon capture and storage through a number of projects that have been awarded funding by government, and then they're getting deployed within the 2020s. So we'll start to see what kind of role blue hydrogen could play going forwards. Green hydrogen is where we see potentially the east of England playing a big part, given it's got a large offshore wind fleet and distributed generation across the region. That typically sees you using electricity from the renewable generators, passing a current through water, which causes the H2O to split into H2 and O, so hydrogen and oxygen. In doing that, you can use the hydrogen as a clean fuel produced through renewables, but you could also look at using the oxygen for other use cases. So potentially in wastewater treatment, or for pure oxygen supplies in hospitals, or even for scuba diving off the coast, that kind of thing. There's almost two products there that you could use and help to create a use case for hydrogen production. There's some others I've popped on the bottom there. I think we're likely to move away from the debate of all these different types of colors. It can get quite confusing and it's not necessarily helpful. We'll probably see nuclear and pyrolysis fall under the low carbon hydrogen banner, along with green and blue hydrogen. I think that the message from government is, as long as the carbon content of hydrogen is reducing over time and ultimately becomes zero, we can call that low carbon hydrogen, and that's something that is compatible with delivering net zero. So if we move on to the next slide, I've just set out on here a couple of those examples that we've discussed already around the applications for hydrogen. So you could use the gas to turn it back into electricity, to send it onto the grid and meet electricity demands. You can use it within commercial buildings and within homes for heat, to meet everyday heating needs. We've also got on there marine shipping. So that's a big, that's a sector that's a large emitter currently today. And really there's not been too much ground that's been made in respect of decarbonising shipping. I suppose the issue with electrifying is that you'll have these large heavy batteries, which aren't necessarily the best option for vessels that are traveling long distance and floating on water. We'll probably see electrification of some types of vessels, but some of those larger shipping vessels, we see hydrogen as a good opportunity and solution. We touched earlier on around the ability to store hydrogen over long durations of time. That's going to help us as we get more renewables on the system to balance the system. Also on there, where we think we'll see some early adoption, especially in the east of England, is around public transport. So looking at buses, coaches, also some of the heavy goods vehicles that pass through the region. So we have a number of key ports which see infrastructure and heavy vehicles coming in from Europe across to the Midlands and down to London and the Southwest. It's a good opportunity there to decarbonise some of those heavier vehicles. In the passenger car market, we're likely to see electrification for the most part, but there is an opportunity as we scale up to potentially see hydrogen form a tiny percentage of that market as well. So if we move on to the next slide, this just walks us through exactly what's happening already across the UK. So the debate really is firmly focused on these industrial clusters. So looking there on the map at Teesside, the Northwest, North Wales, and also up in Scotland at St Fergus, looking at the areas where there's large energy use, large industrial processes that have an inherent demand, which is quite high and often involves high heat usage so for thermal processes. The debate is focused around these industrial clusters because there is that demand on site. So in theory, if you produce hydrogen at the point of consumption as well, you've immediately got a market there, and you solve the issue of what comes first, supply or demand. So the debate is very focused around these industrial clusters. We do see a number of demonstrator projects also across the country in respect of testing the feasibility of hydrogen for heat. So simple things like checking whether hydrogen's more susceptible to be leaking through pipelines and through wells, looking at whether existing infrastructure can cope with hydrogen being passed through the pipes, checking that boiler systems are ready to take hydrogen blends. The gas distribution network companies think that the current network could take up to 20% hydrogen blend. And moving forwards, we'd need to convert the network to enable a 100% hydrogen flow through the gas networks, but that's already underway. Also, we've seen a couple of transport hubs developing. So this concept around aggregated demand. So looking at hydrogen use across a range of fleets and a range of use cases in specific regions. So far, we've seen Aberdeen and Teesside. We think in the east of England, there's good opportunity to see development there as well. So I guess the overall message here is that, so a lot of the debate is around these industrial clusters, but the message is that just because we don't necessarily have that large industrial load in the east of England and we don't follow that same template, it doesn't mean there's not scope to look at developing a different type of cluster, which is based firmly around transport development in the short term and looking at growing that further in the future. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail as we walk through some of the other slides. The final point on there is just around the increasing focus that utilities are showing around hydrogen. And that takes me on to the next slide, which talks through some of those, which walks through some of those projects that are already underway. So the top one there, so National Grid is looking at delivering what it calls Project Union. So that's basically looking at a UK hydrogen backbone, which connects those industrial clusters that we touched upon on the previous slide, looking at that previous map, with some of the major gas terminals in the UK. So we'd see the Northwest and the Northeast connecting up to Scotland and also down through to Bacton, where we've got the two interconnectors that link us with Europe, so with the Netherlands and Belgium. So we'll see that hydrogen backbone span across the country and allow transportation internally, but also externally for export as well. The second one on there is a project which Cadent is helping to lead. So the HyNet project, so that is the Northwest Industrial Cluster. So that's looking at decarbonising some of those industrial loads, largely using blue hydrogen, which will be transported offshore, just off the west coast, and stored offshore, so that the capturing the carbon enables blue hydrogen production, which is low carbon. There's also a project on there I've highlighted, High Deploy. So Northern Gas Networks and Cadent are delivering that. So we saw phase one complete recently, actually. And that was looking at blending hydrogen into the gas network at Keele University. That went well, and so they've moved on to phase two, which is now looking at blending it into homes and a community in Gateshead in the north. And there's around 600 to 700 homes in that trial that are actually receiving hydrogen in their systems today. There's also on there the H100 project up in Fife. So SGN is leading up that. That's looking at providing homes with 300 homes with 100% hydrogen. So not even looking at blends at this point. And then stage 2 will move on to expanding that to 1,000 homes and potentially more, and also looking at some of the wider uses of hydrogen potentially in transport also. I've noted on there Scottish Power and its Whitley Wind Farm, because I think that's quite an interesting one. So the Whitley Wind Farm, it's an onshore wind farm. It's around 500 megawatts, so pretty large up in Scotland. What they're looking at doing is siting a 20 megawatt electrolyzer, so an electrolyzer that produces hydrogen, green hydrogen, in addition to 40 megawatts of solar, but also 50 megawatts of battery storage as well. And the idea is there that you've got almost a clean transport area that produces clean hydrogen, which could be used across a range of activities. So that's an interesting one to have on the radar and keep an eye on. And also at the bottom there, Northern Ireland Water. So looking also at the water networks, what they're focused on. It's quite an interesting use case, water treatment. So not only do you have a large energy demand where you could potentially use hydrogen, you also have fleets attending some of the local water depots, which could potentially be converted to use hydrogen as well. But there's also a use for oxygen within the hydrogen within the wastewater treatment processes, which again creates a further opportunity for using hydrogen. So Northern Ireland Water have placed an order for a 1 megawatt electrolyzer, which will look at exploring that opportunity, and therefore we might start to see that in the wider UK as well, and possibly something that Anglian Water might want to pick up too. So I think we've lost the slides, but we're moving on anyway now to a quick policy run through from Nigel. It might be that Charlotte's dropped out, in which case I can pop up some slides.
If you can, Michael.
2 seconds.
I think I noticed the same thing. It went off about a minute and a half ago.
How is that? Can you see that?
Yes, we can, Michael, thank you.
Yeah, that's super. Well done. Right. Perfect. Good. So Michael's just given us really where we've come from, and I'm going to try and bring us up to date, particularly with the flurry of policy activity that has occurred, particularly since the adoption of the net zero target in June 2019, right up to this week, and obviously the COP26 discussions, but very importantly, the publication of the net zero strategy last week, which has tried to pull together the various different strands of government activity that we've seen emerging over a pretty and increasingly hectic 12 months in particular. I guess one could describe the fundamental challenge for policymakers as how they can now translate the vision that's in a number of high-level strategies, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, the Energy White Paper, transport decarbonisation strategies, industrial decarbonisation strategies, into a programme of specific prioritised activities that actually reduce emissions. So that is the fundamental challenge. I think it's very unreasonable to expect policymakers to know all the answers. I think we're we've embarked on a very challenging but essential journey over the past 2 years of trying to work out excuse me, what moving from high-level concepts and strategies to meaningful programs means, and then delivering those programs and turning it into actual carbon abatement. A very key role has been adopted by the Climate Change Committee, set up in 2008 when the target was very, very different, and who have issued some increasingly pithy and insightful documents around the carbon budgets that are needed to get us to the eventual target. And of course, at the back end of last year, there was a very deep piece of work, well, it's more like a series of telephone directories that the CCC issued, and which really has pushed the debate along considerably. I'll pick that up later. I think it's fair to say that until about 2 years ago, despite the high level of policy activity and a lot of thinking on the earlier stage carbon budgets, hydrogen had been seen as something that was an option or a niche contributor, and probably some way from market realization. But what we have observed really since June 2019 is a very fast escalation of the debate around hydrogen up the policy agenda. And we'll look at one or two of the key documents that have been debated in that area. And I guess what was absolutely noticeable just a year ago, which was the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, for the first time, we talked about top-down targets, not just for offshore wind and other recognized technologies, but for the first time, a very clear set of aspirations and statements about the role of hydrogen. And that was just a year ago. So the debate has transformed considerably over this period. And I think what we have seen since is a translation of that direction of travel into more detailed assessment of the various policy options available for actually hitting those top-down targets, which actually, for the first time, including a 5 gigawatt of hydrogen aspiration in the 10-point plan. So since then, we've worked out what the different roles of the different sectors could be, what the interactions are, where the priorities should focus, and then a key element of the government's thinking was revealed as recently ago as August, when they produced the first UK hydrogen strategy. So if we move on, this is really just, we use this as an aid memoir really, because a huge amount has happened since 2017, when the industrial strategy and the clean growth strategy appeared. At the time, they were, I think, generally very well received as coherent consideration of how we could move towards decarbonisation strategies. But of course, that did predate adoption of the net zero target. And what we've seen subsequently, particularly since the middle of last year, are a number of very relevant documents that have helped us understand the policy landscape and the options. Some of those are from the industry. The first 2 or 3 documents that we show in some way relate to looking at aspects of the puzzle. And over time, we have seen, particularly from the back end of last year, an increasing frequency in publication of increasingly important policy documents. Right in the middle there, we see the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which I've already name-checked. But there is a whole library of documents now on different aspects of the decarbonisation challenge, and increasingly they have tended to focus on different aspects of hydrogen and hydrogen development. I mentioned the hydrogen strategy in August, which is a very comprehensive document with supporting consultations. And again, I've also mentioned most recently something that's not actually shown on here, which is the net zero strategy, which is now called not Building Back Better, but Building Back Greener. And we will allude to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So lots of stuff. We write this up regularly on the Hydrogenesis website. We've got a good back catalogue of summaries of these documents, but if you need help with them, just give us a call and we'll point you towards what we think are the most salient documents and the most relevant points. Moving on. So the hydrogen strategy was originally promised in the 10-point plan, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. It really did mark a acceleration in the government's thinking. It's a very comprehensive document. I think I've heard a number of people describe it as a work in progress, and I'll explain why people are saying that. But the important thing is, for the first time, we do have this starting from today, a very aggressive target of 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2030, and that will sit there alongside the 40 gigawatt target for offshore wind. Looking forward, there are a number of potential pathways, but it does steer a course whereby hydrogen could account for 20 to 35% of final energy demand by 2050. That's energy demand. It is not electricity equivalent. It is a factor of 4 the size of the current electricity industry system. So we're talking about a 30-year window to make hydrogen an absolutely key contributor to the what I've heard called the post-carbon economy. There are some clear commitments in it about making funding available, starting with a £900 million support arrangements, which the government hopes, or Bayes hopes, will pull through up to £4 billion in private investment and 9,000 jobs in the next decade alone. So we've moved from aspiration to a very high level of ambition. Michael's already talked about some of the current projects, predominantly those focused around the industrial cluster, industrial clusters in the Midlands and the North. I think it's fair to say that until recently there was a kind of assumption that in some way the next 15 to 20 years would focus around blue hydrogen development. So cleaning up the gas from the North Sea and other sources, combining it with CCUS solutions, and ensuring much cleaner gas supplies, primarily for industrial processes. I think the August hydrogen strategy changed that quite significantly, and the government places much more emphasis on what it calls a twin track approach, which is it doesn't mind where the hydrogen comes from, whether it's blue or green, not grey, that's from unabated fossil fuels, provided that the market responds and delivers the investment. So I think that was quite a significant change in the tone of the policy debate. And there's lots in the hydrogen strategy around developing appropriate support mechanisms, making sure the regulatory framework is fit for purpose. At the moment, we have separate regimes for electricity, oil and gas, offshore, development of wind farms in offshore regions. And what we do need to do is think about how this can be brought together in a way that allows a fit for purpose regulatory regime for hydrogen as a freestanding part of the energy dimension. There's a whole bunch of things in the UK hydrogen strategy around safety, very important. The assumption we make is that the work will run apace, opening up opportunities for new developments, but under a fit-for-purpose regulatory regime backed off by an appropriate support mechanism. So that is the position we landed at with the hydrogen strategy. Moving on. So I think that's really a point at which to pause for breath. We've seen 2 years of increasingly focused debate around the role for hydrogen as part of net zero. We've moved from a position where the assumption was that hydrogen was first an option that could be deployed in certain sectors, to one where it is now seen as being a potentially transformative factor in enabling decarbonisation, not just further decarbonisation across the generation sector, but in heating, in transport, and across economic sectors. I made the comment earlier that the August document, whilst a good document, was a work in progress. A number of consultations are currently underway. where government is gathering views, evidence, and refining thinking on some very key issues, not least the regulatory structure, the revenue support that will be needed to pull through early stage developments, and also on the detail of the safety case and regime. And it is planning to issue a roadmap with more detail at some point in 2022. That's not very far away. So we are beginning to, if you like, pull together where we think we've got to and look at that alongside our analysis of what we think the regional opportunities are. I think my team, I think, agree with me here. A huge number of potential opportunities that go well beyond the traditional debate around hydrogen as a means of decarbonising industry. And here in the east of England, for the reasons we will pick up later, we believe there are a range of very critical sectors that will allow us to stitch together an approach that is different from other regions. We're very happy to engage with other regions and share our findings, but we're focusing on what we think are the choices here in particularly the New Anglia region, but also the wider East of England area, and how that can be translated into a specific regional policy document or strategy document that has buy-in by regional stakeholders, and which allows us to design and build the foundations for a very different type of regional cluster. So that's all I've got to say for the moment. It feels like it's time for a poll.
Yeah, I think we've had quite a dense and heavy first session, so perhaps we'll have a tea break. We're going to take 10 minutes here, run and get your coffee, and to entertain anyone who wants to stay at their desk, I think we've got some short trivia polls. Yeah, see who has been looking at the Wikipedia for hydrogen. So first question, hydrogen is the most abundant chemical element in the universe. Is it true or false? Guesses, please. Give people a minute to weigh up their options. And the next question down, so this is for everyone to remember their GCSE chemistry. Which chemist discovered hydrogen? Was it Albert Einstein, Henry Cavendish, Marie Curie, Dmitry Mendeleev, or Jules Janssen? Hopefully more than one of those names is familiar. And then finally, our third question, and it's something that we can pick up again in a subsequent session, but which of these is not a method for producing hydrogen? So there's some obvious ones in there, but your choices are electrolysis, gasification of biomass, reformation of methane, as in natural gas, the vaporization of plastic, hydrogen producing bacteria, or coal gasification. So plenty to choose from there. And I'm feeling very smug that having written the questions, I'm going to get 100% on this.
This is where I have to admit that I failed my chemistry GCSE. So, hey ho.
I think you've made up for it since then. You're all right.
Correct answer, Charlotte. Thank you.
So we'll give people a minute to fill that out when they're getting their coffee back and forth. And then Julia will be able to flash up the results and we'll see how our audience are doing.
Good. So what time are we resuming, Charlotte?
I think another 4 minutes. So
Okay.
10 past on the dot.
Super.
Okay, well, I've just had a quick look at those results that are flashed up. I can see we've got a very studious audience with us today. So yeah, everyone's correct that it is the most abundant element in the universe, or thought to be. On question 2, we had 70% of people getting the right answer. That was Henry Cavendish. I did throw some red herrings in the mix. So Jules Janssen was helium. I thought that might trip a couple of people up. And then the last question was a bit deceptive of me, but actually all of the ones in the list are possible. So we won't touch on them today, but things like the vaporization of plastic is a method being developed by the University of Oxford and others. And there are a couple of demonstrator sites being developed across the UK, I believe in Cheshire and southern Scotland as well. So it's got an interesting potential for turning plastics that are not suitable for recycling, chopping more up, microwaving them with a catalyst, and you get an output of hydrogen and then carbon nanotubes that can be used for other processes. And the hydrogen bacteria one, I think it's very much in the experimental stage at the moment, but certain photosynthetic bacteria can produce hydrogen in short bursts. So trick question, but I hope none of you mind. So we will pick up again now where we left off. I originally was going to have this session in the front hour, but we'll condense it up together with the case studies. And actually that might be a helpful way to look at things in combination. We will run from now until roughly 12:30, running through each of these sections. And what we'd like to do is, after each of these chunks, perhaps our moderator will pick one or two questions from the audience, just to kind of see what your interest is in, and we'll try and answer those after each of the mini sections. After that, we'll go for another little poll and coffee break, and then Michael will bring us home with a kind of overarching summary of how all these puzzle pieces that we're going to talk about will fit together in East Anglia. So if I could have the first slide of this section, please. Okay, so I think it was quite clear from Nigel and Michael's introduction that there are three main contenders for hydrogen production at scale at the present time, despite my deceptive trivia question. So that's the blue hydrogen from reformation of natural gas, electrolysis of water to create green hydrogen, and then the gasification of biomass. Now, as with many industry presentations that you may have tuned into, we will be focusing on the blue and green there. But the bioenergy with carbon capture has got significant potential if you think about how rural our environment is, the potential feedstocks from straw and such like. We don't have the time to dig into that today, but it's something that we be keeping an eye on as we develop our thoughts on regional developments. So while we're going to be looking at those two main technologies, they are by no means homogeneous. You can have blue hydrogen at small scale all the way up to a vast manufacturing plants that would be producing industrial scale hydrogen or ammonia. Equally with electrolysis, you could have a small unit that would everything you needed fitted inside a shipping container, or you could have a fleet of electrolyzers stacked together to have a large scale production system. So while we have got the two different production methods, we're talking about how they appear in physical manifestations will be very different from place to place and over time. So given that kind of variation in possibilities, how do we work out which solutions fit which places? So at the moment, the decisions will be made on capital costs, the input costs, what's the cost of gas, what's the cost of electricity, over time, what's the cost of water, and also how much carbon intensity is associated with those technologies. But once you've had a look at those underlying costs, the technology options that you're going to choose for any given location also are limited by the physical assets and infrastructure that you have in place. So is there enough space? Are the appropriate resource connections available? Are there any complementary assets nearby to pair production with? Is it close to the end users to save having to transport it long distances? So these considerations mean that, yes, my apologies. That's my puppy feeling very enthusiastic about whole system planning there. So if we are looking at all these different variables that are going to determine the kind of size and type of hydrogen production, you've got to look at the whole system. So the electricity, the gas, the water, the space, as well as the place-based solutions that work in specific contexts. And I think those are the two buzz phrases that we keep in our minds at all times when we're looking at the energy landscape in East Anglia. Have the next slide, please. Okay, so we've already touched on the potential of Acton and how the OGA and various industrial partners are continuing to scope out options for the site, as well as National Grid Gas. So we strongly believe, and our report online will give you more detail if you're interested, that it could become a significant hydrogen hub. You've got the existing natural gas infrastructure, so if you do want to opt for blue, you've got the pipelines coming in, as well as connections to Europe. So whether the gas is flowing from Europe or hydrogen is flowing back out, that's an important consideration of a potential export market there. Equally, some large offshore wind farms also connect nearby. So there's that opportunity to tie in multi-vectors. You've got electricity coming from offshore wind, gas coming from the UK continental shelf. You've got a coastal location. So if you needed to desalinate seawater to run water through electrolyzers, you've got that option as well. The scale of blue hydrogen potential at the site is only really limited by how much carbon capture and storage you could facilitate in the local area. So part of our study was looking at that potential, and Exodus did provide some estimates based on the depleted gas fields out in the North Sea near us. And the Hewitt field looks like a good potential option. I'll leave people to enjoy our report online because there's a lot of detail in there, and it will go into some of the different considerations that we went through in the planning process. But I'll turn now to the next slide and we'll put on our electrolyser hats. So for the green hydrogen production, we've tried to create a kind of hypothetical diagram here that shows how different parties interact with an electrolyser. So you need some input electricity at step one, whether that's coming directly to the electrolyser or via the power market. There are two ways of structuring that. The electrolyser can produce hydrogen for storage, or it can produce it and deliver it direct to end users. Equally, there are other benefits of the electrolyser that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about specific places. So it can provide support to the grid, and that's something that Nigel will talk about later. Where on the grid would it be most beneficial? Also, the potential to produce medical grade oxygen that Michael mentioned. You know, if you're going to have all of this oxygen being produced, why not capture it and achieve a value for it in the local area? So this is the high level different component parts. They will have different flavours depending on which assets and where they emerge. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to run through three potential options here. And I think they just give us a slightly different angle on the electrolysis picture. So in our region, there is already a significant fleet of offshore wind, and it's set to grow further in the coming years. And more than that, the UK government has committed to having this 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, or becoming the Saudi Arabia of wind, the phrases that you hear from Boris Johnson's speeches. But with that expansion of offshore wind comes increased intermittency. Perhaps there'll be more and more periods where the production from these wind farms is outstripping the demand in the UK. So rather than turn down production, we're thinking of options where this electricity could be diverted to. So one option is to divert it to battery storage, but there is another avenue to explore that is diverting that spare electricity to large-scale green hydrogen production in a bank of electrolyzers, essentially. You know, the hydrogen as a storage medium also counterbalances that intermittency from the offshore wind. And I think for our area in particular, this has got resonance because a lot of local communities are experiencing this kind of difficulties of working out where cabling routes will go, the disruption involved in adding new substations. And we can speculate a future where offshore wind farms are required to collaborate on landing their cables, and maybe hydrogen could be an intermediary step for them that minimises the impact on shore. There are a number of different ways to do that, and we won't dig into it today. And it's not just us imagining this. There are several big offshore wind operators that are already looking at the hydrogen potential. For example, the Gigawatt project up in Humberside, looking to have a large electrolyser in between offshore wind farm and the oil refinery at Phillips 66. Next slide, please. So nuclear, Michael mentioned that it's sometimes called pink hydrogen, but in essence, nuclear pairings with electrolyzers are a really interesting prospect. While we talked about the intermittency of offshore wind and how you use that electricity when it's in excess to demand, it's almost the opposite for nuclear in that it's able to run consistently on that baseload level of electricity. And that's really important if your business case is based on your electrolyzer running in a near constant operation. But even if the setup is different and you want to have the electricity coming from an offshore wind farm or another renewable asset nearby, there's still justification for having it nestled in a nuclear site, because the high-grade heat from the reactor cooling processes offers a really interesting prospect to deploy a different type of electrolyzer that really thrives in that high temperature, high heat steam environment. While these are not necessarily the most obvious commercial product at the moment, that tie-in with the heat could be the way to unlock the commercialization of that technology. So we've mentioned that EDF at Sizewell are already looking at the potential for hydrogen, and their angle is particularly focused on decarbonising the construction element of the potential Sizewell C plant. Equally, nuclear generation is almost always located near the coast, which gives it two advantages. One, if it needs to be paired with desalination of seawater, it's right on the doorstep. But also, we expect there to be a significant future maritime market. So they're already close to where this end user demand will come from. Next one, please. And finally, we're saying small scale renewables, and really small scale can mean anything that's connected at the distribution level, really. So that could be anything from a very small solar farm all the way up to some of the kind of larger developments that are being deployed by utility companies, so larger solar farms, some of the onshore wind as well. So the case here is more about the interaction between assets and the grid. At the distribution network level, especially in our region where it's quite constrained, quite weak in places, having an option to make the most of your renewable energy if it can't always get to the grid is a really important factor. And obviously developers are looking at battery storage. If you look at some of the planning databases, you can see that recent boom. But it's not just about batteries. There's a good case for having a battery and an electrolyzer, and creating a kind of harmonious system whereby we maximise all of the potential output from that renewables asset, and also meaning you can have greater capacity than the grid on its own would allow. And that's a really interesting prospect, given the stresses that the electricity network is going to be under in the next few years, as it's required to connect new EV chargers, new heat pumps. It's going to have a lot on its plate. So minimising the impact on the grid is a key consideration. And we think, given kind of a really beneficial role this can play, as well as the benefits to the asset owners, and the fact that it will be right in amongst the end users, you know, it's bound to be on land that's near a transport route or near a landfill waste plant. You've got direct access to the end user. So we think some of the earlier projects that emerge in New Anglia will be of this style. Small scale renewables, maybe one or two different types in combination with electrolysis. So watch this space as we try and get our thinking out on where and how big these developments should be. Next, please. Okay, so this is where we were going to have the poll, but we'll skip over. And we're now diving into what we were terming our what if case studies. So given that hydrogen is that new market, there's a lot of uncertainty remaining, even if there's a lot of enthusiasm building. So we've got some examples here of generally how hydrogen fits in specific sectors, but then looking at how do these sectors manifest themselves in East Anglia and what that means. So some we can give more detail than others, but I hope you find these of interest and just kind of thought-provoking on how hydrogen might appear in our region. So we'll kick off with transport and my colleague Joanna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Joanna. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to give a bit of context, the transport sector is the highest polluting sector in the UK, even excluding international aviation and shipping. So the challenge is enormous. And the Transport Decarbonisation Plan was published on 14th July 2021 by the Department for Transport, setting out some ambitions and pathways. So the document reaffirmed the timelines for transition to zero emissions vehicles. And that would be by 2030, the end of sales of new petrol, diesel cars and vans. By 2035, all new cars, vans and L category vehicles, so motorbikes and microcars, must be zero emissions at the tailpipe. So hybrids are no longer an option. No new sales of non-zero emissions heavy goods vehicles. And by 2040, the end of sales of all non-zero emissions heavy goods vehicles above 26 tons. So new technologies must be adopted alongside reduced traveling habits and adoption of more active travel. Electric vehicles are likely to dominate the lighter end of transport market, but heavier duty vehicles will require alternative options, including hydrogen. So this is likely to be through fuel cell electric vehicles. And the next few slides will look at the different options available. And just to say, for East Anglia, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan highlights the need to provide refuelling, recharging infrastructure to aid the transition for local road users. In the near term, for cars and light vans, this is likely to be provision of rapid EV chargers in convenient locations, and in the medium term, hydrogen refueling and electric charging for heavier duty vehicles. Okay, so next slide, please. And just for some background, so nationally, cars, vans, and AGVs are the biggest emitters of CO2. So you can see on the graph on the left side that the biggest chunk of the graph are cars and taxis, heavy goods vehicles, and light vans. And in terms of regional transport infrastructure, trip lengths in Norfolk and Suffolk, we're seeing above average trip lengths across multiple transport categories. And that could be even greater contrast for Norfolk and Suffolk, as East of England includes some more urbanized areas as well. In terms of roads, 90% of roads are classed as minor. There is a heavy reliance on the trunk A roads. And in terms of vehicle types, there is an above average usage of all road vehicles except buses. And not all locations are served with regular convenient public transport links, and even rail and bus commuters may use a car to get to the nearest connection point. So given all of that, assuming that EVs will predominate at the lighter end of the market, this immediately flags heavy goods vehicles as a primary concern. And opportunities to decarbonize domestic shipping, buses and rail also need to be explored in the region. So now I'm going to give a quick overview of the hydrogen options in transport. Next slide, please. So firstly, cars and vans. So the electric vehicles are likely to dominate the market. There is a need to evaluate relative costs. However, hydrogen cars might be an option for some specific small vehicle users. For example, if there is a more rurally based taxi fleet that need to travel long distances and cannot easily charge the car, a hydrogen solution could be more viable. Similarly, there is an example from Wales where nurses, for example, that need to travel to people's homes long distances, and charging for 30 minutes would mean that they cannot get to the patient on time. They would greatly benefit from a hydrogen car. In terms of heavy goods vehicles, so like I said earlier, that would probably be a big transport hydrogen demand. There is a high concentration at ports. So, for example, Felixstowe. They are ideal for biomethane adaptation in near term. There is a convenience of fast refueling if essential. There is a need to consider both back-to-base refueling and coast country. In terms of buses, hydrogen buses are most technology mature. There is suit for long distance journeys, the ideal opportunity to reduce inner city air pollution, and major demonstrators examples from around the UK, which we could emulate. Then municipal vehicles, that's varied vehicles in municipal fleets, including gritters and bin lorries. Mixture of ownership, leasing, and third-party service provision. There is activity spread across multiple local authorities, stakeholder, and funding of council initiatives elsewhere. And for agriculture, there is a large agricultural sector in Norfolk and Suffolk, and opportunities for new vehicles and retrofitted dual fleet. Fuel delivery aspects need to be carefully considered and explore opportunities for on-site production of biomethane of hydrogen. So overall, it probably would be the heavy good vehicles, buses, and municipal that are the priority right now for hydrogen. Next slide, please. So now we can look at railway and ports. So rail networks sees heavy usage, especially routes towards London. Local geography and infrastructure mean that Norfolk and Suffolk branch lines aren't necessarily suitable for electrification. However, the line that is on the map on the right, that is in light blue, that's the railway lines that are flagged by Network Rail for hydrogen conversion. So there is some opportunity. And then in terms of ports, we've got 6 principal ports in East Anglia shown on the map underneath, and major opportunities to decarbonize shipping through hydrogen-based fuels. There is at the smaller scale using fuel cells, but potentially as a combustible fuel at the larger scale. And there are good opportunities for development of storage and refueling or on port-owned land. Next slide, please. And so how might these solutions be deployed in our region? So the best are place-based opportunities when transport demand is already aggregated. So East of England has a number of ports ideal for stimulating demand given range of transport modes. Looking at crossovers outside of transport will create further opportunity for aggregating demand. And government funding can support early stage trials. And as said in the UK hydrogen strategy, the first movers in the early 2020s are likely to be relatively small, so up to 20 megawatts, electrolytic hydrogen projects that can be deployed at pace, with production and end use closely linked, for example, at a transport depot or industrial site. And on this picture on the right, we can see Aberdeen's fleet. Aberdeen was successful in many bid schemes and was able to acquire a high hydrogen fleet over time, including buses, bin lorries, road sweepers, and taxis. Next slide, please. So now we can see look at some case studies. The first one is Lowestoft Power Park. So there are several hydrogen possibilities in this site. So firstly, first bus operates across Norfolk and Suffolk. And one of the depots is based in the northern section of the power park, just west of the Orbis Energy Centre on the map. First Bus is interested in developing a strategy for transitioning their fleet away from fossil fuels, and they are open to both electrification and alternative fuels such as hydrogen, particularly where long-distance routes are involved. And as well as the First Bus fleet, there are other small bus companies that provide specific local routes and school bus routes, such as Border Bus and Vertus. Equally, there are private hire coach fleets, resident and visiting, that in time will need to transition. And while some of these are based in East Suffolk and the villages surrounding Lowestoft, there is considerable geographic spread across all of Norfolk and Suffolk. And Network Rails suggested that some of the passenger rail lines in Norfolk and Suffolk are ideal for hydrogen conversion. So you can see on the map there is Wherry line, and that's one of the lines that are flagged for hydrogen conversion. The East Suffolk fleet includes some 40 plus vans, as well as large vehicles used by the housing team. The North fleet for maintenance and refuse collection includes 70 plus cars and vans alongside 41 freighters, 5 road sweepers and 43 tipper vans. So that's East Suffolk Council have a vehicle depot, and the hydrogen options could be considered for new vehicles, but that depends on the replacement cycles. And Suffolk Highways have a depot in Lowestoft as well, which houses local gritters. Highways England may also have vehicles in the vicinity for treating the A47 and A12. That's on the map, the red line. Suffolk County Council have 8 main depots spread across the county, and some might suit on-site production and others simply delivery and dispensing of hydrogen. ABP is the owner and operator of the Port of Lowestoft, and it is already established as an important operations hub for offshore wind developers. The port is undergoing a suite of redevelopments to retain and attract offshore wind companies to operate out of the port. And these activities mean that there is a significant and growing fleet of crew transferred vessels, although there can be fluctuations in fleet sizes depending on construction and maintenance cycles. And large vessels, such as service operation vehicles and construction support vessels, also use the port. So ultimately, the propulsion systems of the vessels will need to transition away from marine oil, but an intermediary step may be the inclusion of supplementary zero-emission systems which operate when the vessel is within 10 nautical miles of a port or at anchor. So this may be fulfilled by hydrogen or ammonia. So like I said, the power park and the pod sit at the confluence of the A12 and A47. And given the lack of motorways in our area, haulage and logistics companies have to rely on air roads to access the various coastal port towns and the major urban centers of Ipswich and Norwich. This means that provision for hydrogen refueling for HGVs will be necessary in places like Lowestoft if we are to support a national transition to hydrogen for heavy-duty vehicles. And the network would likely need to develop a number of hydrogen refueling hubs to make conversion viable, but one of the priority sites must be Lowestoft. So overall, I hope this case study visualizes how finding place-based opportunities where transport demand is already aggregated is essential in successful hydrogen deployment. And another case study is Snetterton. That's on the next slide, please. Thank you. So the area in and around the Snetterton landfill site and recycling centres is proposed as a potential location for a transport refueling hub featuring rapid EV charging and hydrogen refueling for heavy-duty vehicles, including heavy good vehicles and refuse collection vehicles. And according to the DEFRA's Magic Map, the landfill site in Snetterton is deemed rural and the resident population is less than 1,000. The waste site is prime for a new development, including the production of hydrogen for electrolysis and the installation on renewable generation assets such as solar PV. And an electrolyzer is in the order of 1 to 2 megawatts, and solar PV is 30 to 70 megawatts. That could be achieved. Snetterton provides an ideal location for hosting a multimodal refueling hub, as it is bisected by the A11, that's on the map, the red line. And equally, there is a number of active transport users in the location that may wish to support the development of and benefit from new zero emissions refueling infrastructure. It is quite strategically located, because and so that it could be a key component in a wider rollout of zero emissions refueling infrastructure across this region. And just in general, waste sites offer potential for redevelopments with many left disused or with limited future use in predominantly rural areas. And the redevelopment of sites as clean, renewable, and net zero compliant hubs will bring a number of long-lasting and future-proof benefits to the local community. And that will include direct emissions reductions, providing access to refueling and recharging in rural locations, making productive use from landfill sites that are not suitable for other types of developments, sustained revenue stream for district and council through maximizing use of renewable energy, creation of jobs in area with below average wages. And community first, creating a reputation for innovation in tackling climate change. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. I should probably check in with the team in the background. Have we had any transport questions to raise?
Hi, Charlotte, it's Hayley at the LEP. We have a couple of questions from our live stream. One, hopefully quite straightforward one, is whether you think that hydrogen will penetrate the smaller vehicle market. We talked a lot about sort of HGVs, buses, maritime, but what about small, sort of more domestic style vehicles?
I think, as Joanna mentioned, it'll be the very targeted use cases. One webinar that I listened into about the potential at the smaller end of the market, I mean, the big issue at the moment is the cost of those pressurized tanks. They have to be very high quality, as you can imagine. So, you know, it adds thousands of pounds to the cost of the vehicle, makes it very difficult to compete against the cheapest sort of battery electric options that we see at the moment. But in certain use cases, in certain fleets, I think we will see some adoption at that smaller end, yeah.
Thanks, Charlotte. And one other question as well that's just come in. Does the commercial viability of hydrogen require a critical mass? And if so, what might that be?
That's a very open question, isn't it?
Do you want me to have a go,
I think that
Charlotte?
is more true for, sorry?
Do you want me to have a go?
Oh, you're welcome to, yeah.
Yeah, it's not a specific answer. There clearly are issues about scale, critical mass, and the like. However, a key strand of our thinking is around aggregating demand from a number of use cases in particular regions. And whilst that doesn't specifically address general questions, we think there are a number of places where it's more logical to look for hydrogen development and prioritize it, which is one of the reasons we started looking at Lowestoft, for instance, likewise Snetterton, because there are a combination of different use cases that make sense in those particular locations, and where we believe there are good siting opportunities for electrolyzers. So we can't say, you know, at such a threshold, it makes sense. It depends on the security of demand that you can get across a number of use cases, which is why our mapping platform has been very useful to us in identifying some of those opportunities. And then you can start looking at what other allied sectors could provide medium-term demand in a particular region. So that's very much the approach we're adopting. And Lowestoft and Snetterton are two of maybe 10 what we think are very promising locations throughout the two counties where you can begin to think about the practicalities of a two-sided market. That's the first point. The second point comes back to, again, general propositions about, well, solution A doesn't work for transport type 1. I think, and again, this is driven out of our mapping work. There are a number of places on the system which actually may be urban. The logic may tell you that you should see development of EV charging solutions, for instance, but actually, because of the weakness of the local weakness of the electricity system, that may not happen quickly. And because the transport emissions are such an issue in several local authority areas in this part of the world, we can see, particularly if there is a key stakeholder like a council or a waste company who is interested in developing different alternative fuels, including hydrogen, we can see that occurring as well. So it depends on where you are and the context of the existing supply alternatives that you're faced with.
That's great, thanks, Nigel. There was one more question as well before we move to the next case study. Is I suppose follows on from that really, how would that hydrogen refueling infrastructure be funded and operated economically? For electrification of transport, some of that's already there, but the H2 fueling networks just simply don't exist. So have we got any ideas on how these might be funded and operated to make them actually viable?
I think one aspect which we've sort of touched on in a couple of places is that idea of collaboration across different users. So there are probably two funding options. Either there will be a utility company or a specialist hydrogen developer that sees the potential, wants to get the locations and invests for their own sake, or a local group of hauliers, council fleet users, bus owner operators might be prepared to collaborate and share the expense, again, if they can see the benefit over time. So for us, it's a case of keeping those two options open and continuing the conversations to really see what sticks eventually.
That's great, thank you, Charlotte.
Grand. So I think we'll hand over now to my colleague Neve, who's going to have a quick run through of the heat opportunity.
Hello there, thank you, Charlotte. Right, so I will be talking about hydrogen and heat. So if we can go on to the first slide, please. Now, with this, I'm just going to be setting some context, starting with the challenges. Now, in 2020, according to Bayes data, the residential sector that primarily consists of fuel and combustion for heating and cooking accounted for over 20% of all UK emissions, and was the one sector that saw an increase in emissions compared to 2019 levels. Now, in order to reach the net zero target by 2050, virtually all heating buildings will need to be decarbonised. So this can happen in many forms, but decarbonising heating buildings in terms of hydrogen in the UK will require scale deployment of hydrogen, including the necessary infrastructure to facilitate this transition. Now, this includes a number of significant existing infrastructure, including gas grid connections across the region, and this will allow for decarbonisation on a larger scale. So it will cover a larger area. Now, hydrogen provides an opportunity for decarbonisation as an alternative fuel that can be blended into the existing gas grid in order to alleviate some of the dependence on natural gas as fuel for homes. Now, the government is currently consulting on blending of up to 20% hydrogen into the national transmission system, and this is whilst maintaining compliance with existing domestic boilers and appliances. Another option for hydrogen in terms of heat in the future includes a complete conversion to 100% hydrogen in the gas grid. Now, this would require the installation of hydrogen-ready boilers and appliances in homes across the region before this conversion, but this would immediately tackle the dependence on non-renewable fuels for domestic heating in properties, and this is with existing gas grid connections. But a third option for hydrogen can be targeted high-grade heat for specific sites off-grid, and this can serve as use cases for hydrogen in the future, especially for more industrial sites with high fuel consumption for heating and industrial processes. But I'll touch upon that later. But in terms of the latest policy for hydrogen and heat, so the 10-point plan, which we name dropped earlier, announced a goal for up to 20% hydrogen blending into the gas grid. And the results for that consultation should be here in 2023. And then there were also mentions in the 10-point plan for trials of a hydrogen neighbourhood, a hydrogen village and a hydrogen town. And we should see that by the end of the decade. And now the hydrogen strategy, which was published this August, and that reaffirms these commitments made in the 10-point plan. And it launched some new consultations with the results due to be published in 2022. Other headlines from the hydrogen strategy include the reconfirmation of the commitment to 5 gigawatts of production capacity by 2030, another £900 million of funding, and the twin track approach to hydrogen, but that's just aside from heating. And the final policy document I'd like to touch upon is heat and building strategy. That was published this October, I believe, and it just reiterates some of these commitments that were made in the previous 2 documents on hydrogen for heating. And the government plan to make a decision about heating for homes in terms of hydrogen by 2026. So we've got another 4 or 5 years to wait for that. However, there's lots of information that is still to be published and spoken about around the uncertainties about hydrogen, but hopefully we'll see this in the next 5 years. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I just mentioned, hydrogen's role in heat is not clear, but demonstration activities continue to test technical feasibility, so safety and feasibility studies that are occurring now. And some of the government announcements include supporting a hydrogen neighbourhood trial by 2023, a large hydrogen village trial by 2025, and then the hydrogen town trial will be at the end of the decade. And the government will continue to work with Health and Safety Executive to enable up to 20% hydrogen blending on the existing gas network by 2023, and a launch call for evidence in 2022 to seek views on mandating hydrogen-ready appliances. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please. So this is the state of play in New Anglia. Now, I'm not going to read off the slide, but what I would like for you to take home from this slide is this map. Now, as you can see, kind of brown lines, there are gas pipelines across the New Anglia region, which is Norfolk and Suffolk. So you can see the gas pipelines, you can see Bacton Gas Terminal in the northeast, and you can see the gas offtake points in the dark brown circles. So we've got West Winch, Brisley, Rudham Heath, and Yelverton. But what I want you to cast your eyes almost back towards the background of the map is the shading of the grey and blue. Now this is showing where gas consumption lies across the region. So from light blue, you've got kind of lower consumption to the darker blue, which you've got higher gas consumption. Now this gas consumption means gas connection, so where the existing gas network lies and where it's being used. So from this, we can see that the gas consumption mainly lies in the urban areas. You've got Norwich, Ipswich, Kings Lynn, Thetford, and across the coast of East Suffolk. But gas grid connections do vary across the region and across local authorities and between local authorities. More urban local authorities such as Norwich have up to 90% of homes connected to the gas grid. And then you've got more rural local authorities that have, 50, 60% connection of homes. So this can be a challenge in hydrogen for heat because the homes that are not connected to the gas grid, they will have to have alternative solutions to decarbonisation, such as electrification or the use of biomass. That's the main thing I wanted you to take from that map. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide is about potential demands. Now, by demand, we don't mean how many people want this hydrogen in the future. It's more about the sheer volume of hydrogen that will need to be provided to fulfill its projected roles. At the moment, the difference of hydrogen quantity needed to achieve a 20% blend in the grid, what we were talking about earlier, and an 100% conversion, the difference is enormous. It's not a linear jump either. So this is really something that will have to be looked at in the future, and we'll need the support by the government and the information that they are due to provide in the next 5 years to tackle that kind of jump from 20 to 100%, if that is something that is possible in the future. But just quickly touching on the last point, actual uptake will depend on different things. So obviously the timing of the 100% hydrogen conversion depends on this this jump between the quantity of hydrogen, the adoption rate of electric heating. So that means if electrification is provided in some areas, that might influence the amount of hydrogen demand that we see there. So we need to find that balance on where electrification will occur and where hydrogen therefore may be needed and used. And an important point is the policy direction that the government will take in the future. That will depend on the uptake of hydrogen, and that's something we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on. So next slide, please. So this is just about deployment of hydrogen. Now, an obvious opportunity in the region for hydrogen blending is across the 5 gas offtake points across Norfolk that I mentioned earlier. There's also a few in Cambridge and Essex, but if we focus on the 4 in Norfolk and 5 including the Bacton gas terminal, this is potentially where we can see hydrogen blending of up to 20% in the future, and potentially 100% conversion if we look that far ahead. But another potential demand for hydrogen can be industrial users with high-grade heat requirements, and this can be enabled through government funding and support in the short term. For example, the industrial fuel switching grant that may enable the use of hydrogen for industrial users located near these gas offtake points. Next slide, please. Thank you. Excuse me. This is just a little case study I've got for you. Now, this is the Yelverton gas offtake point located southeast of Norwich, and it's from the national transmission system into the Cadent distribution network. And this is definitely a place of interest in the future for hydrogen blending. Now, as you can see from the map on the left, this area is well served by high and intermediate pressure lines, and pouring land, which is circulated in blue, could potentially serve as a hydrogen village trial, given its proximity to the Yelverton offtake and its self-contained and isolated nature, allowing for easier control of the area. In this instance, homes with existing gas grid connections would undergo partial decarbonisation through the increase of hydrogen being blended into the gas grid at Yelverton. The proximity of the village to the gas offtake point would mean that homes here would receive a high percentage of hydrogen blend compared to areas further down the pipelines. And if you just do another click, please. Here we are, here's a new map. And from this map, we can see where crossovers with other sectors may occur in the future and where further opportunities for aggregating demand may lie. For example, at different transport hubs across the area, you can see the Postwick Park and Ride on there, kind of northwest kind of the map. Also, you've got wastewater sites scattered across the area, as I think Charlotte mentioned before about the options for the use of oxygen here as a byproduct of the hydrogen production process, and also the industrial users, as I just mentioned. For example, if you see on the right of the map here, we've got the British Sugar Factory. That's a big point source of emissions, and that's perhaps somewhere that could be decarbonised through the use of hydrogen. And I think that's everything from me. I'll pass back to Charlotte for some questions.
Thanks, Niamh. Did we have any questions on this topic come in from the audience? I think it's a very tricky one.
Sorry, yeah, we have, and in around the sort of processing space, what are the key milestones that would enable hydrogen into the grid? What would we be looking out for?
So there's probably 2 strings to that. One is the safety and testing case that's been undertaken. So there's a plethora of different network companies across the UK looking at, what effect does it have on the pipe materials? What happens if there's any leaks? What happens if you allow a certain concentration to interact with appliances of certain ages? There's so much that they need to check for the safety case. So watching those results come out in the next 2, 5, 10 years will be essential, but also we need that direction from government. So Niamh's flagged some of those promised consultations, so taking a view on whether to mandate hydrogen ready appliances. So that would be saying Perhaps they want to introduce a deadline, no more new gas boilers after this date. And I think there is probably a stick in the sand already on that. But what they could say is, you know, a few years before that, if you are going to install a gas appliance, make sure that it's a hydrogen appropriate one. So keeping an eye out for date commitments that the government puts out is going to be key for us as we go forward, really. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, sorry, Charlotte, go on.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, second to your, just reaffirming your point there, in respect of gas boilers, I think industry is saying that really there's no significant additional cost for just making sure that your new boiler is hydrogen ready. And so that's an easy win, really. It's a low cost option which keeps doors open as we go forward in the future. And if we have a gas system that's converted to hydrogen, then at least we've got the infrastructure in place at the domestic level so that there's minimum disruption to consumers at that point. Because you don't really want, you know, in the 2030s, everybody going into consumer homes to switch out all the boilers because we didn't mandate it slightly earlier on. So the sooner we get that implemented, I think the better. But yeah, scope to do that now, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, any signposting that you can get now helps to keep options open or keep potential development pathways open. So I think the network companies will be pushing government to get that clarity as soon as possible. So yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, audience. I'll turn now to do a quick run through of the agriculture sector. Now, this is not one that usually gets a lot of attention in hydrogen webinars. I imagine a few of you have listened to transport and heat topics before. But given the rural nature of Norfolk and Suffolk, given the fact that, you know, 73% of land on average in our region is designated agricultural, up to 85% in certain local authorities, we think it's an absolutely key sector for us to consider as we develop our strategy. So if I have the next slide, please. The challenges for agriculture. The main one is the fact that farms come in all shapes, sizes and specialisms. So trying to develop a policy or a support mechanism or a template even is so hard when you've got you know, a small family orchard comparing against an extensive livestock farm. You've got to find a range of options that will work in these different compartments and at different scales. The other thing that is really difficult, and is one reason that perhaps progress in emissions reductions has stagnated a bit in agriculture, is the fact that the bulk of the emissions are not tied to direct energy use. You know, it's not about the electricity and the gas, it's more about the soil management, the land management, the livestock management, and having so many different types of emissions from so many different sources makes it very difficult to get a quick win that you can get in some sort of commercial industrial processes. And finally, another challenge is the fact that by their very nature, the farms can be quite dispersed and reliant on rural infrastructure. So it makes innovation or collaboration with other users a bit harder than you would in urban environments. So perhaps why it gets less attention than it should. But that's not to say that farms aren't actively looking at their decarbonisation opportunities. You'll see, you know, last year and you know, very recently in light of the COP26 topics, that NFU have been putting out material on how British farming can become more sustainable. They've got a target to achieve net zero for the sector by 2040, recognising that some farms will still be emitting and others will maybe producing negative emissions to create that overall net zero picture. One thing that we need to keep an eye on as we're developing ideas for the agriculture sector is the Agriculture Bill from 2020, which is creating a new post-Brexit framework for how environmental measures are rewarded for farmers. And it's going to be quite a slow 7-year transition from the current system to this new framework. Equally, a hot topic for us will be red diesel. And we know there's the competition out there at the moment looking to solutions where hydrogen or other fuels could replace red diesel, targeting initially construction fleets and quarrying, but in due course, the red diesel rebate for agriculture will end, and there will need to be a replacement fuel in place by that point. And I think if you look at the COP26 messaging that's coming out, agriculture is a key thing globally, and it's not just something that Norfolk and Suffolk need to worry about. It's a very sensitive sector to climate change. It touches a range of different aspects of our lives, from food, transport, biodiversity, even flooding. And while what I've said so far might sound a bit intimidating and a bit pessimistic, there is actually an enormous opportunity for the agriculture sector to not only change from being a source of emissions to being a sink for emissions. And again, that's something the NFU look at. With proper land use management, with some different practices, farms could be sequestering carbon rather than producing it. But turning now to the next slide, we'll think about how hydrogen fits for agriculture. Oh no, I've still got some emissions to get through. I won't dig into too much detail, but this raises an important point, or two important points. It's not all about carbon for agriculture. Nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions are much greater in the sector compared to carbon emissions. And that's probably something we need to do wearing our net zero hat, thinking about appropriate fertilizer use, different land management processes, or even some elements of habitat restoration. But we'll cover that complex topic another day, and I'll continue to focus on those carbon emissions. Where they do have carbon emissions, there's probably three key areas. One will be heating, so sheds and buildings, vehicles, obviously, but also in the application of lime to soil to change the acidity. And then the second main point that I've already touched on is the fact that emissions reductions have been stalling, plateauing in the last few years, and you can see there was even sort of slight hiccup upwards in 2017. So given that baseline, what can we do? Next slide, please. I've tried to pick out three different avenues that we need to explore. One is hydrogen vehicles and the stationary machinery that you might have on site, so ranging from small forklifts up to larger kind of diggers, telehandlers, all the way up to the larger tractors and combine harvesters. So battery electric vehicles may suit some cases, but larger vehicles that have heavy duty cycles, such as combine harvesters, when they're running, they need to be running 12, 15 hours a day. There's not going to be time if you've got a very specific weather window to plug in for an hour or two, which a vehicle that size would probably need. So perhaps something like hydrogen could fit that niche. But having said that, there's really potential obstacles around fuel deliveries. So a lot of the farm vehicles will rely on red diesel deliveries to site, and will hydrogen be able to be delivered in the same way? I'm hopeful that it is, but it's something to look at. Heating for livestock sheds or processing plant may benefit from hydrogen boilers. So if we were to look at some of Neve's beautiful maps, I don't have one to hand, but it would show you how many different poultry farmers we have in the area. And if you're raising small birds, you need to keep them warm in a lovely big shed. So there's high heat requirements in some locations. Some farmers will already be looking at ground source heat pumps. Some may have even already got biomass boilers in the last decade or so. But hydrogen is a competing option there against electrification. And finally, one again that's a bit tangential to some of the topics we talked about today, but ammonia-based fertilizers. And that ties into both the carbon intensity of making that fertilizer, so a sort of third-hand emission, if you like, but also the kind of application of it to the soil and those methane and nitrous oxide emissions that could be associated. So at the moment, ammonia fertilizers come from that grey hydrogen, the dirty stuff. Could we transition to an environment where locally produced green hydrogen provides an ammonia fertilizer to local farmers. Obviously, they've got to find that balance of the cost of having this extensive plant in a centralized place against that local delivery system, and there's probably a balance to be had. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, unlike the lovely presentations before me, I have not been able to do a proper case study, partly because there is so much diversity and uncertainty in how hydrogen could work on a farm. But let's have a think about hydrogen vehicles in particular. So I've got some nice pictures on the side there. The top one is the New Holland Highland hydrogen tractor. Still very much a prototype at this stage. And then below is JCB digger. And you'll have seen alongside some of the COP26 outputs that Rise Hydrogen, JCB, and an Australian hydrogen producer are planning a collaboration in order to make a push for construction and heavy lifting vehicles. So prototypes will be turning to commercialisation in due course, but I think the vehicle manufacturers need a signal from the market to say, yes, that's going to suit us, that's going to fit this use case. Because there seems to be a bit of hesitancy on that side when they've got so much other to focus on in the HGV and rail markets, perhaps. So the prototypes need to be commercialised. But more than that, there needs to be a range of different vehicle sizes. I think, as I enjoyed 1.5 hour last year, looking at the second-hand market for the tractors, you can see not only is these tractors are used for long periods of time. They're not having the regular replacement cycles that an inner city bus would have. And also they are purchased based on specific criteria, different size, different lifting capability, different attachments. So there's so many different things that people would consider when they buy these vehicles, that they're not like for like in the way that one car is very similar to another car. So having that range of options available will also be key to stimulating that market. And I mentioned this before, but the refueling infrastructure needs to be in place. Larger farms will have diesel storage tanks where they can have a large delivery at once and then just use it as they need it. Could there be something like that for hydrogen? Obviously, the storage requirements are more complex, more costly, but could it be done? Or would it be better to have on-site production where you're just constantly making a bit and constantly refueling your vehicles? Different cost profiles, but both an option. Equally, the touch points with third-party road haulage. So for those of us who live in Norfolk and Suffolk, you'll see large lorries moving potatoes and sugar beet around. These are not necessarily owned by the farms. There'll be third parties moving it between the farms and the processing facilities. How do we engage with those third-party hauliers? Do they want to refuel at their depots? Do they want to refuel en route? Do they need to have a backup option of refueling at the farms at the furthest reach of their route? And I think one thing that has come out in the research as well is that farmers are about to face pressures from a number of different areas. Trying to get an appropriate carbon cost on meat and competing against imports of that meat from elsewhere, land management requirements, biodiversity requirements, funding pots, where is it coming from, what's it viable for? There needs to be some clear signposting on helping the transition financially for those vehicles, or else it'll just be one thing on a long list of decarbonisation checklist. Next slide, please. And this is just a flag. I won't go into detail, but there's lots more work that needs to be done in surveying the area, working out the viable options, and really getting on the ground and talking with people that are going to need to interface with this technology. I think given that we've got some time pressure, I won't ask for questions from the room, but if we've got time at the end, we'll come back to it. And instead, I'll pass on to Nigel to talk about the value of hydrogen, both in power generation and in flexibility markets.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was an excellent walk through 4 of the key sectors by the team, which I think hopefully demonstrates the depth and diversity of our thinking around the hydrogen agenda anchored in this region. So a further locational issue is this issue of flexibility. Earlier on, Charlotte and Michael both touched on the issues around temporal production, shortfalls, surpluses. In parallel, there is a very significant and interesting debate going on within the energy industry around this question of flexibility and when you can have power at the right time. And one of the issues that we've begun to research recently concerns this issue of storage interaction between renewable generation, batteries, and what is potentially a pivotal role for the use of electrolyzers to allow you to manipulate on a locational basis demand and supply, and also through using hydrogen in storage. So we thought we'd add a section on this. I like to think it's an area that we're doing some genuinely interesting work at the moment. So moving on, please, Michael. So at the moment and historically, one of the main focuses of thought within the sector has been really around how hydrogen can be used to blend in to existing fossil fuel assets, gas and peaking diesel turbines. That is an important issue. And here in the New Anglia region, we've of course still got a very large combined cycle gas turbine station at Great Yarmouth, which potentially could link up with a blue hydrogen supply from Bacton. It could also be the landing point for repurposed offshore wind assets, maybe from Scroby Sands. So there are some very real issues there. And we have a number of peaking flex gen operators throughout the region who don't use a lot of fossil fuel, but when they do, they burn gas or diesel. So looking across the agenda, we need to have a sensible narrative as to where these might fit within the hydrogen transformation. As we've seen already today, there's been an upswing of interest in electrolyzers. Charlotte referenced the work that's already being done around Sizewell C to decarbonise the construction process. And we are also talking with at least 2 developers around new demonstration electrolyzers that might be located around waste management facilities, landfill gas sites, very specific siting investigations that also look at what the potential local demand might be, particularly from the 2 sectors that Niamh and Charlotte have just taken us through with transport and agriculture. And it's that circular economy, localized focus that we think is quite different around our thinking. What we do know is, however, that the east of England and the coast, the North Sea coast, is seeing fast and significant deployment of offshore wind assets. And although it gets less attention, it is very clear there are very good opportunities for developing onshore wind, and we're beginning to see significant scale development of solar at a number of locations in Norfolk and Suffolk. So we're beginning to think about, how can we learn from the lessons of the past? Many people on the call will know that there's quite a strong local debate about some of the existing wind farms and how they transit through, the power transits through the region. And what we're beginning to do is think about how a more firmly rooted regional economy could be developed using a mix of onshore and offshore assets in combination with deployment, particularly of electrolyzers. I think our thinking is reasonably advanced. We know there are a lot of issues being debated within the energy sector, particularly the electricity industry, around national balancing services, around local flexibility markets, and we are trying to develop our mapping platform in a way that allows us to better understand what the local issues are and what the local opportunities might therefore be. And we're in a good place to continue that conversation because many of the electricity distributors are about to go into their next price review periods from April 2023, and a key element of the regulatory policy sitting behind RIIO-2, as it's called, is turning the providers of wires into the people who direct the traffic on a local basis, making sure that local supply and demand is optimized in a framework where unnecessary or early investment in new network capability can be avoided. It's a very key issue, and we are actively involved in that debate. In a number of very different ways, we're trying to act as a bridge between industry debates, energy industry debates, and local hydrogen opportunities in a way that allows us to move towards a more regional supply and demand solution that captures the benefits within this region for businesses and householders. So that's the context of the debate about flexibility. It may seem a little bit arcane, but it's very, very important in ensuring that net zero can be delivered at least overall cost to consumers who ultimately at the end of the day will be paying for it. Next slide, please. This is really just a screen grab of a very important document that's issued every year by National Grid, the Future Energy Scenarios document. They have 4 pathways to net zero, one of which isn't actually compliant with net zero. It shows the huge requirement that will arise as a result of accommodating faster and increased renewables deployment offshore, onshore, and how the delivery system to consumers needs to evolve to make sure that a necessary investment in more generation, in extra wires, can be kept to the lowest overall cost. And for the first time in the FES document, as it's called, this time we're seeing significant deployment of electrolysis by 2050. Our view is that electrolysis is much closer to market than that traditional narrative suggests. So we're trying to fast track our thinking about how flexibility markets could be looked at so that they turn electrolyzers from being perceived as a problem to one where there is a real flexibility benefit. Moving on. I've really talked about, I think that's Great Yarmouth at the top, which is a nearly 400 megawatt gas turbine, and also King's Lynn, which is slightly smaller, but there are smaller CCGTs, and I think an important element of a regional strategy that works for New Anglia will include within it specific steps towards blending hydrogen sooner rather than later, and what the best locations are for sourcing that hydrogen. And that is one of the work streams that we are considering. There is also interactions with the gas grid, assuming we do end up developing hydrogen neighbourhoods, as the government has said we must do from 2025. We need to not only understand how to blend hydrogen, but also how to de-blend it so that we can meet operating parameters safely within the existing gas networks. And one or two of our ideas, our work streams are, and I think Niamh mentioned Yelverton a short while ago, are looking at the practical issues that would need to be addressed to allow regions in Norfolk and Suffolk to compete into the hydrogen neighbourhood competition that the government is likely to announce in 2023. Charlotte's also mentioned interactions with ammonia fuel, both in terms of use cases, but also as a storage medium. And we think the potential interplay between batteries, hydrogen storage, fuel cells, and ammonia stores is something that is not very well understood, but is a very important strand to our thinking here in the New Anglia region. And that then feeds into use of all these conversion technologies into energy stores, which is going to be increasingly important to allow further renewable deployment on a local basis going forward. So moving on, this really just gives a little bit more detail about where this flexibility might come on. It is very clear electrolyzers can respond quickly, provide frequency, fast response. They can be turned up and down and are a very natural competitor and potentially a complement to conventional storage batteries, of which we're already beginning to see deployment at a number of sites in East Anglia. There's also fuel cells as a means of taking the hydrogen and turning it back into electricity. There are a number of very complex interactions, but the whole point about the evolution of the electricity system to hit net zero is that we need to understand those interactions, but also importantly, what works best where. And at the moment, we have some very blunt balancing services that operate at a national level and some very much emergent local flexibility markets that are being developed differently in different parts of the country. And we think a very important area of having a coherent hydrogen strategy is working out what works best where and why. And we're beginning to focus on that question going forward. One of our forthcoming projects we're hoping will be something in the innovation space that explores these options in much more detail than our industry has done to date. Hopefully that will again bring the New Anglia region up to the vanguard of the debate around hydrogen deployment and net zero. I think that's probably it for the moment, Charlotte.
Yes, I think that's super. It's probably time that anyone who needs to have a comfort break or get some extra caffeine, we'll take 5 minutes now, just before our final session. We have got another interactive poll. This time it's more opinions than trivia. So apologies to everyone who's expecting another round of hydrogen pub quiz preparations. Julia, if you could boot it up in a second. Okay, here we go. So we would like your views, see if they correspond to ours. What sector do you think best suits hydrogen in our region? So we've got transport and heat, agriculture and food processing, power generation and grid support, all of the above, or none of the above. So there's an option for the pessimists as well. Give everyone a section. I think I also have to choose one to see the next question. The next one is about expectations. So our presentations have flagged some of the uncertainty that's tied to certain dates in the future about policy commitments, feasibility confirmations. But when would you expect hydrogen vehicles to be a commonplace sight in Norfolk and Suffolk? 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, or unlikely to see them in our region? Choice 4 can be anything you like. The final question in the round is, when should low carbon hydrogen be used? This is more trying to capture views of if people are in certain camps. Do you feel like electrification should be the priority in all cases, so only deploy hydrogen where it isn't an option? Perhaps you think that the specific best case is heavy duty surface transport. Perhaps you think that aviation and shipping, they've made very little progress in carbon abatement reductions so far. Perhaps the hydrogen and the e-fuels associated with hydrogen are best placed for those sectors. Is it heating? Or perhaps almost just doing a like-for-like swap for where it's used now in ammonia production? Very tricky for me to pick one of those out of the list, but let's see what the group thinks. I'll just give a minute or two as people grab their drinks, and then we'll see what the results have to say. Thanks for that. I'm glad the poll results pop up on the screen. And optimistically, everyone has said all of the above for the first question. So good to see that you agree with us that there's plenty of applications for hydrogen. Interesting in the date ones, the most popular choice was 2030 for commonplace hydrogen vehicles in our region. And not to give it away, but I also chose that option. I think we'll see some small scale sort of demonstrator level adoption in the next 5 or so years, but really the transition will start in earnest in the 2030s to 2040. And then finally, the best sector, most people opted for heavy duty transport. And again, that's one I picked. I think it's a natural first mover, even if the rest of the use cases that are listed in that options over time will also have their hydrogen moment in the sun. I think now we will let Michael take us home with a kind of overarching picture of some of the topics we've talked about today. And then if we have time at the end, we'll come back to some of the questions that we haven't been able to get to. But over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, so we thought
I think you've got a microphone issue, Michael.
better.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah.
How strange. We're good to go though. Yeah, so I was just saying, so we thought at the end of the session it would be good to bring together everything that we've discussed so far and look at what we see as the future pathway for hydrogen deployment in the east of England, looking primarily at 2030. So at that point, what would we want to have seen? What do we see to be success and a good first step? And then what do we need to see by 2050 in order for the east of England to be a big part of the net zero jigsaw in terms of hydrogen deployment? So first and foremost, I just set out on here some key influencing dates. So obviously these are a front end heavy based on the fact that a lot of the announcements so far and a lot of what's been announced in policy is within the next few years. So next year we should have confirmation on the coverage of the net zero hydrogen fund. So that's going to be a £240 million pot. I think the consultation closed at the end of just at the end of last month, based on what the fund would look like and its scope. There's a lot in there in respect of the kind of production methods that will be granted funding, and in what applications you would be eligible to apply for the fund. So we'll wait to see the outcome of that. I think that's due in early 2022 for launch in 2022. Also on there, the outcome of on the future of the gas system. So a consultation is going to be launched looking at what role do we even think that the gas system is going to play ultimately by 2050? Is it going to be a large role whereby we see 100% hydrogen grid, or less so? And also on there, the decision on blending. So it's looking like, given the positive results of some of the safety studies that have gone on so far, it's looking like we will get blending in the grid by 2023 in specific areas. And we might see that more widely across the grid by 2025, 2026. So then moving to 2025. So top of that list there, we've spoken about the mandating of hydrogen ready boilers. So currently that's put at the 2026 level. I think the idea is that we wait to see how blending goes initially, and then we make a decision as to whether we're going to mandate hydrogen ready boilers. I think industry thinks that could be brought forward slightly, maybe 25, 24, but it's currently set at 2026. And also upgrade of the gas distribution pipeline. So under the Iron Mains replacement program that actually started in 2002, a lot of the gas distribution networks were being upgraded from some of the steel pipes to polyethylene pipes, which are basically plastic pipes, which are less likely to fracture when hydrogen's sent through, and less likely to leak hydrogen, which is more common in steel pipelines. So it's looking, I think we're around 60 to 70% complete in terms of upgrading the distribution networks at the moment. And by 2026, we think that we'll have those networks ready to go. Moving to 2030, so looking at the transport market, so we get that ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars. But we also have the UK aiming for a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035. So at that point, you'll definitely need to have seen an uptake of hydrogen in specific markets, thinking about transport and taking a chunk of heat as well. Moving to 2040, we've got that ban on some of the larger vehicles, so the HGVs. That's where we think hydrogen is most suitable in respect of the transport markets, as we've outlined before. And so once we've got that ban, we'll start to see a big uptake in those heavy duty vehicles. But we think there's a use case to get that going a little bit sooner, as we've already outlined. And then 2050, we've got that net zero target date, and we've got the Climate Change Committee quoting that hydrogen will form a part of around 1/3 of UK final energy demand at that point. So that's a big chunk that we need to see growing in the years to come. So I suppose that the key message there at the bottom of the slide is that there's lots that's going on, and there's lots of stuff that's going to come into place very soon that we need to start thinking about. And so as a region, we need to be clear in our own mind what our priority areas are and where we should be focusing, so that the picture is clear, and so that we can take advantage of some of these funds that are upcoming, such as the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. So looking at a roadmap to 2050 for our region. So looking at the early 2020s, so we actually think there is opportunity to move now based on some of the work that we've done already. So looking, within the next couple of years, finding an initial cluster such as at Lowestoft, whereby you've got production of hydrogen on site, which can be used in a variety of forms, such as for the local transport fleets, for wastewater treatment processes, or for some of the marine shipping vessels and the railway lines as well. So we see almost a cluster forming. Lowestoft we flagged here, but it may be in other areas such as outside Norwich. So thinking about the Hethel Centre and the work that Nigel alluded to earlier. So by the late 2020s, we will see a number of these clusters forming. I should probably say mid to late 2020s, based on some of the stuff that we're seeing. So we'll see, further fleet conversions. So we've got a lot of local authorities right now with ambitious net zero commitments, many of them committing to net zero by 2030. And so as part of that, there's going to be a need to decarbonize fleet. And you wouldn't necessarily do all of that, bang on 2030. You would want to take advantage of replacement cycles to lower the overall cost. And so we'll start to see, or we could see local authorities being the initial driver for some of those hydrogen fleets, which anchors initial supply, which can then enable wider scaling across the region and further opportunity for hydrogen. There's also, a number of city hubs that we think could be good initial test beds for hydrogen transport. So we're looking there at the big cities, big city of Norwich and the two towns of Lowestoft and Ipswich. And then by 2030, we see these clusters starting to merge. So we're seeing increased uptake in towns and more rural communities. The Felixstowe port, we know that they got granted free port status, and as part of that, there was the concept of becoming a hydrogen supply hub. So we'll see hydrogen production there within the coming years. And as part of that, there'll be decarbonisation in the local area, which can start to span out. Bury St Edmunds, so we did some analysis on Bury early on, and we basically mapped the traffic flows that were going through the town. And there's actually a higher proportion of HGVs passing by than you would think. Obviously, the main A14 passes through, but you've got the port of Lowestoft, whereby that traffic is travelling up to the Midlands and also across the country. So you have larger vehicles that are passing through the region, which creates options for hydrogen refueling infrastructure. But not only that, there's also the nearby fleets, and there's a fair few nearby fleets around that area that could potentially anchor some of that demand, anchor some of that supply, sorry. And then again, the wastewater treatment plants, which we discussed earlier around potential hydrogen use, but also oxygen use. So by taking that approach, we'll see a scaling of hydrogen production over time, and therefore a reduction in costs also. And at that point, you'll start to see a proper regional hydrogen economy come to fruition. But the key message, I suppose, is we can move now, and we can get this going sooner rather than later, and create a different model to those industrial clusters in the east, whereby we take this demand aggregation type model and create a different type of cluster. So just looking in detail then at 2030, so what do we expect to see by then? So we think that we'll see both blue and green hydrogen. We know there's work going on led up by the OGA looking at making Bacton a blue hydrogen production facility in the future. And they're looking there at getting CCUS licenses in place by 2023. So that hydrogen can be produced by the end of the decade, so to 2030. And obviously, there's the storage offshore there in the depleted gas fields of the carbon, and also green hydrogen. So that's almost twofold. So you've got the large scale production offshore, of which there's a growing fleet in the east of England, but you've also got that distributed renewable generation across the region. Much of which is curtailed at times more than 20%. And so there's a huge amount of energy there that would otherwise be wasted that could be used for producing hydrogen. And also I mentioned there for nuclear, so Charlotte touched on that earlier on. There's an opportunity there to take advantage of some of the baseload energy that nuclear provides, to get high load factors on your electrolyzers to produce zero carbon hydrogen. The point there as well on injection and blending into the gas system. So we'll see that at the main gas offtake point. So we've highlighted Yelverton there as probably a good first example, an early mover, given the proximity to Norwich and some of the nearby fleets and other opportunities for hydrogen decarbonisation. We'll see a range of applications uptaking hydrogen, but it will be that transport sector that will drive uptake in the near term. And also the idea that electrolyzers can offer flexibility benefits, as Nigel mentioned just now. That's especially important in our region, given the electricity network is so constrained. And so we think that could be a big feature through to 2030. And then 2050, many of you might have seen this network diagram before, but it basically sets out the role of hydrogen across the region and what that might look like. So we'll see the blue and green hydrogen production. So at Bacton, the blue hydrogen production, we'll see the carbon stored offshore and then the hydrogen sent across the country, but also over to Europe via the two interconnectors. You've also got the continued aggressive build out of offshore wind, which will create opportunity for potentially producing green hydrogen at scale for the region and to be sent further afield. Injection and blending, we'll see that across the system in respect of demand clusters, so that will be cross-vectoral, and we're expecting to see uptake in markets like transport, heat, flexibility and agriculture. Moving along that east coast, so if we start there at the Great Yarmouth CCGT that was mentioned earlier on, there is actually a direct pipeline from Bacton which connects through to that plant. you could see up to a 50% blend. The CCGT can take a 50% blend currently as is, and so that's making a big dent in one of the larger emitters of the region. You've got the Lowestoft cluster, which we've mentioned before. We think that could be an early mover. The Sizewell nuclear power station, and maybe the Sizewell C in the future. You've got the Felixstowe port there, where you've got the road, rail network, and also some of the marine and shipping applications. And then further afield across the region, you've got those those range of applications. So agriculture, hydrogen for heat, hydrogen for transport, etc., etc. So in respect of next steps, our plan is to develop a clear strategy for the New Anglia region, setting out what exactly we think New Anglia can contribute to the hydrogen debate, but also the things that we should be doing in the near term to enable that. And we'll look to work there with the local councils and some other key regional stakeholders. A few of the key projects there that we're looking to progress. So the Lowestoft Power Park, as we've already mentioned, the Snetterton Clean Transport Hub, so potentially looking at refueling there on the strategic part of the A11. Freeport East, we know that the developments going on there could see large-scale hydrogen production, which needs to be off-taken somewhere. And the Bacton Energy Hub, which we know will be a key UK asset, but also key across Europe as well. Probably not on there because we've just had announcement of awards of the Community Renewal Fund, is also the Hethel Innovation Park that Nigel mentioned earlier on, just outside Norwich, seeing potential for hydrogen development there also. We've developed this mapping tool that Nigel mentioned earlier on. We use that a lot internally to identify a lot of these opportunities, and so we thought there's probably other bodies out there that would make use of that. So we're looking to launch an online platform by the end of the year with the final version in January, and we'll get that up and running then. And then the final message, I suppose, is just making sure that we're ready to participate in some of those large funds, like the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund when that launches next year, and also get collaboration going at a local level, demystifying the concept of hydrogen and setting out what can be done now in the near term to get things moving. So I think that is all I had to say. Nigel, shall I hand over to you for a final wrap up?
Yeah, I think so. I'm conscious that there are a number of questions. We've been trying to answer the questions as we've gone along. There are a few that we haven't picked off. We will come back to the individuals on that afterwards. I guess for those who want to follow what we're doing, do look at our Hydrogen East website, but also the website of our kind of side project. So it's not a side project, it's kind of an overarching project, I guess, around Net Zero East, where we also set out some of the work we're doing to work with key regional stakeholders to help abate emissions more generally. I hope you've seen today two things. One is how important hydrogen is going to be in providing progress towards net zero. It is a huge challenge, but hydrogen has a very important and significant role to play. And I think it's fair to say over the 18-month life of Hydrogen East, we've seen more than subtle changes in the terms of debate, and we are focusing on the things that we can influence in this particular region based on the needs of the areas, and they do differ from local authority to local authority. Important differences between Suffolk and Norfolk, and the same applies once one starts looking more generally beyond the east of England. But I like to think that what we've managed to do this week as COP26 unfolds is to take stock of the learnings that we have carried out, reached over the recent past, and I hope you agree that from the presentations today, I've got a very capable team who are embracing the real practical issues in a way that hopefully will place the New Anglia region in the forefront of the debates around a different type of hydrogen cluster. Please sign up to our various Twitter accounts. We like Twitter, and there's my New Anglia Energy one as well, for slightly more informal comment on various matters, some work related and others less so. We will continue to build on the good work. We're delighted that, you know, COP26 will act as a wake-up call, and we're hoping that we can actively participate with a range of local stakeholders, businesses, local authorities in putting this region at the front of the, or have a seat at the table in the negotiations, the conversations, the policy deliberations that are going to occur now with an increasing speed following the Glasgow meeting. So hopefully you've heard a lot that has interested you today. Each of my team have become real experts in their areas, and we're looking to support regional stakeholders in making an impact in the debates that are coming our way in the very near future. So thank you for following us today, and we look forward to engaging with you more generally in the coming weeks and months. So thank you very much. Thank you for the LEP for arranging this, and thank you to the Greater South East Energy Hub for supporting the event. And I hope you've learned something from today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.